Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast, where we explore what it means to cultivate peace within ourselves while working toward a more just and harmonious world. Join us as we uncover stories, practices, and ideas that inspire grounded collaborative action for lasting change.
Okay, I'm here with Kazu Haga, who's well known around here and is an author and a practitioner and trainer and all things relating to nonviolence. We're going to have a really interesting conversation today. Welcome, Kazu.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
So on Grounded in Peace podcast, we focus a lot on the spiritual and kind of philosophical roots of principled dimensions of nonviolence. So I'd like to get into that, but could you just start off by telling us about your own journey, the things you're most passionate about, your main interests?
Yeah, that's a big question. My own journey, I oftentimes start my story when I was 17 years old. I was in a pretty broken place in my life. I dropped out of high school when I was 15, and there was a lot of violence in my home that I was trying to escape from, and in and out of trouble. And I met a group of Buddhist monastics who were really committed to nonviolence and social change work. And they were from a Japanese Buddhist order called Nipponzan Myohoji. And they were organizing a walking pilgrimage. They were going to walk from Massachusetts down the coast of New Orleans and then eventually down the coast of Africa to retrace the Middle Passage and to begin the process of healing from the legacy of the enslavement of African people. And I heard about it like a week before it started, and kind of on a whim, I told my mom I'd check it out for a week because I was bored and I had nothing better to do. And I ended up leaving home for a year and a half.
Oh my gosh.
Spent 6 months walking to New Orleans with them, and then a year living overseas between India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka in their monastery, studying Buddhism and studying nonviolence. Wow. So that was my introduction to all of this work. And, the story goes on, right? Like lots of twists and turns. Mm-hmm. But I had another kind of moment of awakening in 2008 when I took this 2-day workshop on a philosophy called Kingian nonviolence, which is the philosophy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And that 2-day workshop just changed my life forever and taught me the depths of, as you said, the spiritual and principled philosophy behind nonviolence. And so that's been my passion ever since, is to better understand what it means to be a practitioner of nonviolence and to live a nonviolent life.
Wow. Yeah, and you've written a couple of books. I know there's a group here that read your book, Healing Resistance. Is it 2 books that you've written?
It is. Healing Resistance was my first book, and it's kind of the teachings of Kingian nonviolence told through the lens of my life.
Yeah.
And then the book that just came out a little over a year, or almost a year ago, is called Fierce Vulnerability, and it kind of combines the ancient lineage of nonviolent action with a deeper commitment, or a deep commitment, or recommitment perhaps, to spiritual practice, and mixing in some of the newer sciences around trauma healing and understanding how trauma impacts our brains and our nervous system, and really looking at nonviolent action as a form of collective trauma healing work.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I was going to ask about that. You use the language of trauma and healing. Do you use it in a way how do you connect that to nonviolence? Do you prefer that language? Do you find that it connects better with, what's wrong with us or something?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a preference. I think it's not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. I think Dr. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Cesar Chavez, Dorothy Day, all these people who advocated for nonviolence in the past, they didn't have access to the science that we do now around our understanding of trauma. I think they were always talking about it and understood it intuitively. I think intuitively, nonviolence has always been about healing. But I think the new sciences that we have now around understanding how violence and injustice and oppression impacts us at the kind of brain chemistry level maps very well to how people like Dr. King talked about how violence and injustice impacts our soul.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just a different lens through which we can look at the same thing.
Yeah, one of the things, we've had Paul Chappelle come here to Ashland twice, I think. It's been a while, but you mentioned him in Healing Resistance, and I think it's to the effect that you're dealing with a question, or he's dealing with a question, is violence in our nature? But and really his answer, I think your answer is no, because in fact people are traumatized by violence, and it hurts us. It hurts people who are committing violent acts, people who are receiving violent acts. But no one's been traumatized by an act of compassion.
That's right. Yeah, and the first time I met Paul years ago, that's what he said, is like, if violence is part of our human nature, then shouldn't we be able to engage with it without it breaking us? Like there's a reason why not even participating in violence directly, but just being exposed to it can break our brains forever, right?
Yeah.
And there's something about that that I think speaks to who we are as human beings and as a species.
Right. So say more about the kind of spiritual depth. I mean, I think probably a lot of people, when they think of nonviolence, they think of work. Does it work?
Yep.
And often it does. I know Erica Chenoweth's book, is really good on this, having done that research. But, sort of beyond the question of whether it works, there's this spiritual or philosophical dimension. Say more about that and, what you're trying to highlight for people.
Yeah, well, I'll start by sharing a piece of wisdom that I learned once so I do a lot of work with incarcerated people in California, and one of them, who I've known for, I think, feels like 15 years almost, once told me that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And if we only think of nonviolence as a strategy, then we can do a lot in terms of fixing issues, right? We can pass new legislation, we can get politicians out of office that we don't want, but it does nothing to repair the relationship between people and between communities who have been fractured through a conflict. And nonviolence is ultimately about doing both, right? It's about fixing issues and repairing relationships. And to me, that's where the spiritual side and the philosophical side of nonviolence is really important. I use the word spirit broadly. I oftentimes joke that the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of my spiritual mentors, even though I'm sure he would hate being called that.
Yeah.
Because when I hear him talk about the cosmos, it leaves me with the same awe and the same kind of humility at the vastness and the mystery of the universe that a spiritual experience leaves me with. And so I think we need to understand spirituality broadly as something, it is anything that connects us with a sense that we are part of something so much bigger than ourselves as individuals.
Yeah.
And after 20 years and 25 years of doing this work, I've really come to understand that the essence of nonviolence is about this unwavering belief, on this unwavering knowing in our bodies that we are part of an interdependent universe, that I will never be free until all of life is free.
Yeah.
And I think it's that commitment to nonviolence that ties it to a lot of spiritual traditions who have always taught us the same thing. And it's that commitment to universal belonging that can guide us in our efforts, not just to pass legislation and fix issues, but also repair relationships and make our communities whole again.
Yeah. Are you... This may be putting it too strongly, but are you critical of some aspects of modern nonviolent movements? Like, are people neglecting this spiritual side? And what are some of the, if so, I mean, what are the downsides? What are we missing?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to let my critical side lean too heavily into being judgmental, which is a place that I sometimes struggle with. But I do think that a lot of practitioners of nonviolence, on the one hand, focus solely on the strategic component of nonviolence, which is absolutely necessary. It's important. But in doing so, we may be gaining short-term victories and fixing issues, but doing so in a way that is actually sowing the seeds for future conflict, or widening the fractures between communities in the first place, right? I do think that a lot of so-called nonviolent movements move with an energy that is actually the same seed of the energy that created all of the violence in the first place, the energy of separation, the energy of fracture, the delusion of individualism, the delusional worldview that says, me and my people can be free once we beat those people over there. But at the same time, I will also say that a lot of people who are more committed to the spiritual side of nonviolence, I do sometimes experience some spiritual bypassing where people are comfortable sitting in their monasteries and in their churches saying, we believe that we are all one, but are not in the streets risking their bodies in the way that advocates of strategic nonviolence are, to fight for justice and to protect communities that are being marginalized by state violence. And so I really think that true nonviolence comes into emergence when we're able to understand the power and the need for both the strategy and the principles.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there? I was having a conversation with a colleague this morning about what are the we're talking about what are the spiritual practices that for nonviolence. And I've been reading Tolstoy, and who's really at one end kind of the philosophical principled, let's say. And then I'm aware of Gandhi's spiritual practices, and and his critique of living in cities. And I mean, there was a lot to him. I think a lot of people. I was wondering, in King's version of nonviolence, this was the question that came up this morning. Are there spiritual practices? And I mean, maybe the broader question is like, what do you think are the spiritual practices that people can adopt? And to loop back, I mean, where do those show up in the traditions of nonviolence?
Yeah, well, King was a minister, right? He was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and he was the son of a minister and the grandson of a minister, and the entire civil rights movement grew out of the church, the Southern Baptist Church. And so I think it's important to always remember that for him, King's resistance and King's commitment to nonviolent action grew out of his commitment and his faith, right? And, I think some of the ways that manifested in the civil rights movement are the constant prayers and even the freedom songs that they sang were all spiritual practice that kept them grounded in something larger than themselves as individuals and kept people unified. And I think it's important for every individual today to find the spiritual practices that work for them. I don't think it ever works to impose one set of spiritual practices, but some of the things that have been important to me, in addition to my own Buddhist practice, I think is kind of remembering that we are part of the natural world and connecting with the natural world and listening to the natural world, and remembering that the changes that are happening on our planet right now, we are no longer the agents of change. Like, as an activist, especially on the kind of strategic nonviolence side, I've always been trained to believe that we are the agents of change. But I've now, largely through my spiritual practice, come to a place where I've accepted the reality that there are forces so much larger than myself that is driving the changes that are happening to the planet. The Earth itself is going through a transition with climate and everything else that is happening. And part of what we have to accept is that perhaps the best thing we can do is to learn to be in right relationship with the changes that are happening and be guided by the Earth and be guided by voices and powers that are greater than us. And so I think, again, as an activist, I've been trained my entire life to figure it out, right? To figure out how to get us closer to freedom and liberation. But I think so much of the work that we need to do right now is to learn to listen. And to me, that is a spiritual practice. Right? Quieting our minds down enough to listen to the voices of emergence, to listen to the planet, to listen to the Earth, and to be guided in our movements by those voices.
Rather than opposing primarily. I mean, I think you may end up opposing anyway. But sure. I mean, you talk about the unfortunate hyphen that shows up in the word nonviolence sometimes, and how it sounds like we're simply negating. So, but talk about how you conceive of nonviolence as bigger than the mere opposition to violence.
Yeah, I always say that the biggest misconception, the most dangerous misconception of the word nonviolence is this idea that as long as I'm not being violent, then I'm practicing nonviolence. I oftentimes share a story about years ago when there was a fight going on outside of my house. And there was a woman on the ground who was getting beat. She was screaming for help. And so I ran downstairs and managed to break up this fight. And by the time I got down there, about 15 of my neighbors had heard the commotion. And they had all come outside. And they were just standing around watching this woman get beaten, not doing anything to help. And I always say that all of my neighbors were practicing non-hyphen violence, in the sense that they were not being explicitly violent. They were being not violent. And you could even argue that I was more violent than my neighbors were, because I did use physical force to pull the person off. And so you see how big of a difference it makes when we understand nonviolence simply as not being violent. But nonviolence is really about when you see violence in your neighborhood, when you see violence in society, when you see violence in your own heart, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
And it's a commitment to taking action to try to intervene when you see violence and when you see fracture, and to trying to move us towards this vision of beloved community that Dr. King talks so much about.
Right. Well, and especially you use the language of healing. If clearly there's no healing if we kind of stop at breaking up parties, or we ended the conflict. I forget the terminology you used. Conflict. What is it? Resolution versus reconciliation. Right. So there's more to that project.
Absolutely.
If we include reconciling. Because I think, again, I just read your book recently, so it's fresh in my mind. But I think I'd read about how you could say that a conflict has ended just because people go their separate ways and they're not actively in conflict anymore. But what about next time they see each other? What's that interaction going to be like?
Yeah, I mean, you look at Israel-Palestine and how many ceasefires and peace treaties have been signed. But because there's been no effort at actual accountability and reparations and reconciliation, all of the things that are necessary for reconciliation to take place, it's only a matter of time before the next conflict erupts because there hasn't been healing. Yeah. Right? And so if we don't center healing and really hold healing as the long-term goal and constantly move towards it, there's always going to be new conflict.
Yeah, yeah. You do work in prisons, right? Is that something you do regularly, or?
I do. Less and less these days now that I'm a parent, and it's hard to be away for long periods, but it's one of the greatest privileges of my life is having had the chance to learn from incarcerated people.
Yeah. Well, so Ashland University has a sizable corrections education program. Yeah. And so, I've had the experience of interacting kind of in a virtual way with, a lot of inmates, and in some cases in the prisons, and I know lots of my colleagues have too. Talk about the work that you've done in the past. I'm really interested in how, is it trainings that you do or other kind of efforts to bring about healing and so forth?
Yeah, yes and yes. So I do trainings. I mostly King-A nonviolence training. So we have teams of incarcerated people who have become certified to become King-A nonviolence trainers and have then gone on to train thousands of incarcerated people in nonviolence, trying to create a culture of peace from within one of the most violent institutions in our country. But also I do a lot of restorative justice work and trauma healing work, and it's that work that witnessing people who have been through some of the most violent lives that you can possibly ever imagine, and working with people who have not only experienced violence but have perpetuated some of the worst forms of violence we can imagine, and witnessing them become some of the most committed peacemakers I've ever met in my life, some of the most compassionate people I've ever met in my life, has renewed my faith in our species and has shown me our resilience and what we are capable of, right? Yeah. And so, that is why it's one of the greatest privileges is to be reminded constantly about our capacity to heal.
And are people signing up for these? I mean, how does that work? Are they drawn to the topic before you show up?
That go on for years, oftentimes. And some of the healing work that I do, we talk about issues that, like if these people talked about it in the yard, it could actually put them in danger, right? Because they're talking so openly and honestly about some of the violence that they've experienced and some of the violence that they've perpetuated, including against more marginalized people, against women and against children, and that kind of thing could really put people in danger in the yard, right? And there are so many people who come to our courses and they're like, I've been waiting 20 years to be able to talk about this thing that I experienced when I was a kid, and that I've never had space to talk about it. And so, I think that's the thing about nonviolence and healing, is that there is some part of us who understand that if we don't talk about the experiences that we've had with violence and these traumatic experiences, it continues to weigh us down and it continues to impact everything we do in our life. And so creating spaces for us to talk about these things and moving through a process of healing is incredibly liberating. It's hard work, but it's incredibly liberating.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like, so you're dealing with people who are prepared for that hard work, probably recognize it takes that.
Yeah. And like the deeper the harm, the deeper the healing. And when you are working with, I work mostly with lifers, so people serving life sentences for having committed pretty serious offenses. A lot of what they've done and a lot of what they've gone through it's pretty extreme. And so the courage and the commitment that they have to actually talk about that wound openly it's so inspiring. And in so many ways, this is a lot of what I've talked about in the recent book, that is what our nation needs to go through, right? Like our nation has deep wounds from our collective early childhood traumas of genocide and enslavement. And these are traumatic experiences that we experienced in our collective childhoods that we've never had a chance to talk about openly. Like small pockets of activists and healers talk about it all the time. But as a nation, we've never actually reckoned with this history. And so I think that is the work of nonviolence at its best, is creating space for our country to actually talk openly about the pains of the past and to figure out some way to move through in a way that brings us closer to healing.
Yeah. So, what does that look like? You've got individuals who can kind of take that brave step.
Yeah.
What does a collective version of that look like?
Yeah, well, so I think the first thing that needs to happen is, you can't work on healing if you're actively being harmed by the same system that created the first trauma in the first place. And when you look at, recent ICE murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and all of these things, these are the kind of ongoing legacy of wounds that go back hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
So I think we need to use nonviolent intervention to stop as much of the harm as possible in this exact moment so that we can get a little bit of breathing space and then think about what it takes to move through collective trauma. I remember years ago at Standing Rock, I had the privilege to spend a little bit of time there, and there was a healing ceremony that happened when hundreds of U.S. Army veterans went to Standing Rock, the indigenous community that was fighting the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And these veterans got down on their knees and apologized to a group of indigenous elders for all of the harms that the United States military has been responsible for on indigenous lands for hundreds of years. And not only were they there to apologize, many of them in tears, but they were there to put their bodies on the line to try to protect that sacred land, right? And so I think that kind of both the action of like putting their bodies on the line to protect sacred land, and also to grieve and to atone for the pain that has been living in our lands for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think that kind of thing can move us closer and closer to real healing.
Wow. Yeah, that's moving. I think I may have seen that in Michael Negler's The Third Harmony. You were in that.
I was.
That's so moving. Is there an issue with who they're representing? Are they representing themselves? I assume they're not representing officially the U.S. Army.
It was definitely not an official U.S. Army.
Is it too much to hope for that we would? It's not about to happen anytime soon, but down the line.
Yeah, I think down the line that is the hope, right? Is that we get the state itself to acknowledge the harm that it has committed. But in the meantime, we don't have to wait for the state. There are individuals that are part of the state or was part of the state, like these veterans, who can atone for the role that they played. And, in restorative justice work, one of the things that I do is to facilitate dialogues between incarcerated people and the people that they've harmed. And oftentimes we go through this process and prepare and talk to both sides individually, and then at the end decide that one side or the other is actually not ready to come together, and that if we brought them together, it could be re-traumatizing. And if that's the case, we oftentimes do these things called surrogate dialogues, where we take the survivor of the harm and bring them face-to-face with incarcerated people who committed similar harms, or vice versa. We bring survivors to meet with incarcerated people who, have experienced similar harms. And it is equally healing for accountability to happen, not across the actual people who experience the harm together, but people who are close enough, relatively speaking, to the experiences that they can still bring healing to that relationship. And so, I think it's a similar thing that the Army veterans, they may never have committed harms themselves on U.S. indigenous soil, but they know that they represented an institution, a collective body that did. And so some of that shame and that trauma, it was infused into their bodies, right? And so for them, getting down on their knees and apologizing for that wasn't just the right thing to do for incarcerated people, but it was also healing and lifting a burden from their own souls.
Yeah. Boy, the nature of that kind of spiritual connection that creates or fosters or strengthens is really worth thinking about. Like the example of writing letters of forgiveness, but like not mailing them.
Yeah.
It just makes me think that we don't have to have this kind of one-to-one correspondence between like the offense and the reconciliation for some good to happen, within the soul. It's like we need that language somehow, some heart, some soul language to talk about that.
Yeah, and I was just recently in a conversation with another friend of mine, Reverend Liza Rankow, who just published a book called Soul Medicine for a Fractured World. Yeah. And she was saying that, sometimes you need healing with this one particular individual, and for whatever reason, that's not accessible. And there's still value in having a conversation at a spiritual level with that person, whether it's by writing a letter that you're never going to send to them, or praying to them, or whatever it is. And there still is healing that can come of that. Like, your healing isn't dependent on what anyone else does, right? There's a lot of ways for you to heal.
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. So what are some of we talked about practices a minute ago. Are there practices that, you said you didn't want to kind of specify for people, but you mentioned listening, and I love what you said about sort of listening to the natural world, and sort of maybe it's a practice for listening to each other, but let's talk a little bit about communication. Sure. I remember one of the things you mentioned, we did a nonviolent communication training here. It was really good. And I remember what you said in the book, that it feels scripted sometimes. So I wonder, but that's also a practice. It's a practice of communication, Absolutely. And so is listening,
Yep.
So what do you advise for people who want to improve whether it's listening or speaking, but their communication, their openness to other people?
Yep. So nonviolent communication is great. For those that don't know, nonviolent communication is an entire language that was created by this guy, Marshall Rosenberg. And it really teaches us to listen to our own bodies for what we are feeling and what our needs are. And there's so much wisdom that comes from that. And oftentimes in NVC practice, we practice these forms, right? And I oftentimes compare it to, if anyone has ever done karate, there's a thing called kata, which literally just means form, which is a series of movements. It's like right punch, left punch, upper block, front kick. And you do those scripted motions over and over and over again until they become like muscle memory, like wax on, wax off in the Karate Kid. And at some point they become muscle memory so that when you're in an actual conflict, these movements come much more naturally. But if you're ever in an actual physical conflict and you enter a kata and you go right punch, left punch, upper block, whatever it is, like it's not going to go well for you because it's too scripted. And so I think the thing about nonviolent communication that's important to remember is that it is like a martial art. It takes years of dedicated practice for it to become our default, and so that it can become naturalized. So the practice is really important, but to really, when you're meditating, the intention is to become aware of our breath and become mindful of each moment. And the intention isn't to just become mindful only for the periods that you're meditating, but to bring that mindfulness out into day-to-day moments, right?
Yeah.
And so similarly in NVC practice, we're trying to infuse it into our bodies so that it becomes part of our default operating software.
I love that. Really, that's the point of any practice, is that it becomes part of who we are. It takes a long time.
Right, yeah.
Let me get your thoughts on something I read from Thich Nhat Hanh, or maybe he said this, that we're often told, don't just sit there, go do something. And he says, but his message is, don't just do something, sit there. And, I love that because it feels like a corrective, for a certain kind of activist person. How do we know when to sit there and when to do something?
I actually don't think those things are mutually exclusive. There's a well-known teacher, author named Bayo Komolafe, who has this famous quote. He says, the times are urgent, we must slow down. And he said once that sometimes he gets some pushback on that. He says, Bio, look at how urgent the times are. We don't have the privilege to slow down. And he said, slowing down is not a function of speed. It's not about, I'm too busy, I need to leave all this behind and go away and take a vacation. He said, slowing down is about deepening our awareness and noticing who's in the room. And so I think Thich Nhat Hanh would agree with this, that he's not suggesting that we don't act. Like he is the founder of one of the biggest Buddhist movements that is socially active. But I think his teachings would say that even as you're at a protest, to remember to breathe, to remember, as the elders at Standing Rock taught me, that you are in a ceremony, to notice who's in the room, to notice the humanity of all of the people around you, your fellow activists, and what they may be holding in their heart, as well as the police officer and what they may be holding in their heart. And to be in that protest, but in that moment of the protest, to slow down and to maybe not like sit on a meditative cushion, but to bring that moment of awareness and that mindfulness into that space.
Wow. Yeah. What a great response. Thank you very much. And then tonight you're talking about fierce vulnerability. Just say briefly what you'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah, so fierce vulnerability, like the elevator speech that I always give, is that it's the intersection of spiritual practice, trauma healing, and nonviolent action. And what the intersection of that can give us in this moment of polycrisis and the Great Turning, when so many of the systems that we've grown accustomed to seems to be in a state of collapse, and there's pandemics and climate crisis, and the traditional ways that we have become accustomed to create social change may not be working anymore. And so in this moment of crisis, how do we respond in a way that gives us the power to stop injustice, but to also cultivate the love that is necessary to heal injustice?
Yeah, very good. All right, well, we'll look forward to that.
Awesome.
Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.